And in any case, I have only a little neck. I have a little neck. She laughed at his mercy, joking about her own death. Maybe she was hopeful. Maybe she believed her husband still had a soft corner for her. Maybe he at least prayed for her. She was wrong. Because the day she died, Henry VIII began erasing even her existence. No prayers for the woman who kept praying even after death. No funeral, no coffin. Just a wooden box. And 340 years later, when workers finally opened her grave, what they found inside was shocking. And Boleyn was not wrong about her neck. Welcome back to History Untold. I'm Alex, and together we'll uncover the hidden secrets of the past. If these untold stories speak to you, hit the like button and join our family. Let's step into the past together. 14 days. That's all it took to destroy a queen. On May 1st, 1536, Anne Boleyn sat beside Henry VIII at a tournament, smiling, watching, still queen. 11 days later, she was locked inside the Tower of London, accused of adultery, of betrayal, of incest with her own brother. 11 days. That's not justice. That's speed. The kind of speed that doesn't ask questions because it already has answers. The truth is, the outcome may have been decided before an ever stood trial. Men were picked up and questioned. Gentlemen, courtiers. Music, one of them, Mark Smeaton, a simple musician, broke. He confessed under pressure, or most likely under torture. The others refused. Even when facing death, they refused. But it didn't matter. Then came the trial. One day. Just one. A Queen of England judged in hours. The men who sat in judgment were not neutral. Their power came from the king. Their loyalty belonged to him. 26 peers found her guilty, not after weeks of evidence, not music after careful debate, but after a single swift performance dressed up as law. The sentence was brutal: burned alive or beheaded. The choice would be the king's. And this is where the story turns cold. Henry VIII chose beheading. Not the usual axe. Too messy. Too uncertain. He ordered a swordsman from France, a professional. Someone who could end it in one clean strike. People called it mercy, but the truth feels heavier. Because even before the court had finished its work, Henry VIII had already arranged for a swordsman to come from St. Omer, France. Not after the verdict, before the end. And that changes everything. A king doesn't summon an executioner like that unless he already knows how the story ends. He built the charges. He allowed the lies. He signed her death. And then he made it elegant. And Boleyn understood that. She was sharp enough to see what was coming. And on the night before her execution, she reportedly laughed. Not from music joy, but from the bitter clarity of it all. She told the constable of the Tower of London that she would be easy to execute. I have a little neck, she said. A joke about her own death. Because what else do you do when the system has already decided? But that was the night before. What happened the next morning? Music is something else entirely. The coffin nobody ordered. They remembered to bring a swordsman from France. They forgot to bring a box. The morning was clear. She dressed carefully, a dark gray gown. Some accounts say it was a gray damask trimmed with fur at the collar. Underneath, the red petticoat. Her hair was pinned up with care, lifted away from her shoulders, gathered tightly, exposing the neck. Some said it was done for modesty. Others believed it was practical to keep it out of the way of the blade. She walked to the scaffold on Tower Green with 4 of her ladies behind her. Contemporary accounts say she was composed, unnervingly so. She gave a short speech. She did not accuse Henry VIII directly. She did not name names. She did not fight music back in the way people might expect. Instead, she thanked the king for raising her so high. In that time, no one could speak against the king, especially if their family was still alive. So she spoke carefully, not because she had nothing to say, but because her words could harm her family and her daughter. And then she knelt. The French swordsman had concealed his blade to avoid frightening her. As she prayed, her ladies removed her headdress. She looked straight ahead. One stroke. It was over. Now here is the moment that tells you everything about how the court around Henry had stopped functioning as anything resembling a civilized institution. Nobody had arranged a coffin. The woman who had been Queen of England for 3 years, who had sat beside her husband at state banquets, who had been anointed with holy oil at her coronation, who had received ambassadors and dined with bishops, lay on a scaffold with no coffin waiting. Her ladies stood there stunned. And someone ran to the nearby Tower Armory and came back with an elm arrow chest, a long wooden box designed to hold weapons. That is what they put her in. An arrow chest, a simple wooden container normally used for storing or transporting arrows. Her head was placed carefully beside her body inside it, and then the lid was shut. And there was a bitter irony in it. Records indicate that for Christmas in 1532, Anne actually gifted Henry a set of exotic, pierre and boar spears, a traditional hunting gift presented in a simple elm chest, the kind used in court exchanges, the same kind of container now holding what was left of her. She had been deeply religious. She had supported the reform of the English Church. She had carried a book of hours, an illuminated prayer book, and had written inside it the words Le temps viendra. The time will come. She believed in resurrection. She believed in the dignity of Christian burial. She received none of it. No mass was said over her body. No formal funeral was arranged. The arrow chest was carried through the chapel door of St. Peter ad Vincula, the small church within the tower walls, and placed in the chancel, the holiest part of the building directly in front of the altar. The earth was opened. The box was lowered in, and that was it. No headstone, no marker. Nothing to say that Anne Boleyn, mother of the woman who would become Elizabeth I, was lying here. Henry, meanwhile, was reportedly at Hampton Court that afternoon awaiting news of her death. When the cannon fired from the tower, the signal that it was done, he is said to have gone out riding. The following day, he was formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. One day, not a week, not a month of mourning or even the appearance of it. One day after the woman he had upended the entire English church to marry was buried in an arrow chest with no marker, he announced his next bride. That is not grief. That is not even the performance of grief. But the full weight of what Henry did and did not do only becomes clear later. Because what he did next wasn't just moving on. It was erasure. Let's pause here for a moment. Because there's a question a lot of people ask, and it sounds reasonable on the surface. Was Henry actually so kind to Anne that he changed her execution? England had a tradition. Traitors were beheaded with an axe. That was the method. That was the law. But Henry didn't order the axe for Anne. He sent to France, all the way to St. Omer, and brought over a skilled swordsman, a professional, someone who could end it in one clean, fast stroke. People say that was mercy. That Henry, despite everything, still cared enough to spare her unnecessary suffering. But here is the thing that doesn't fit. If Henry truly cared about her in those final days, if there was even a small piece of the man who had once loved her still present, then why did he never order a funeral? He knew Anne. He knew her better than almost anyone. He knew she was deeply religious. These were not small things to her. They were everything. And Henry knew that. So the question isn't whether he ordered the sword to spare her pain. The question is, why did he spare her one thing and then deny her everything else that mattered to her? That contrast feels intentional, almost calculated. And it brings us to something far more uncomfortable. Did Henry ever regret it? Did he ever tell anyone that he was thinking about what he had done to her? We know that Henry did feel regret in his life. He wept over Thomas Cromwell, the very man he sent to the block. He reportedly said afterwards that he had been deceived into killing a faithful servant. He called it a mistake. He said it openly. He never said that about Anne. In all the years that followed, and Henry lived another 11 years after Anne's execution. Was it shame? Was it hatred? What is your opinion? Tell me in the comments. Because what happened after Anne's death wasn't grief, guilt, or even silence. It was something far more deliberate. The king, who later admitted that Thomas Cromwell's fall was a mistake, never showed regret for executing his own wife. Why? Because kings could afford to admit errors when it stayed political. Cromwell's death was seen that way, a political mistake. But Anne was different. She was his queen. And the charges against her were far more serious. If Henry showed regret, it wouldn't just be personal. It would reopen everything. It would suggest he had condemned an innocent wife. And then, there was something even deeper. Anne's death was tied to the greatest promise of his reign, a son. When Edward VI was finally born, he became Henry's legacy, the proof that everything had been worth it. But if Henry ever showed regret for Anne, it would raise a dangerous question. Was the path to his son built on a mistake? So, the king made a choice. He didn't just move on. He removed her from history. In the weeks and months after her death, something quiet but organized spread across the royal palaces of England. Her initials, the monograms carved into stone, stitched into fabric, painted onto walls, were taken down, chiseled out, replaced. Anywhere her name had been joined to his, it was gone. Her portraits were not saved or kept. The image we know today, the dark-eyed woman in the French hood, survived mostly by accident, through copies made later. The Tudor court made no effort to keep her face in circulation. Her daughter, Elizabeth, just 2 years and 8 months old, was declared illegitimate, same as Mary before her. Henry now had two daughters he had officially decided didn't count, and a new woman already waiting. Jane Seymour moved into Anne's rooms. Anne's jewels went to Jane. The replacement was total and visible, done out in the open for the whole court to see. And then Henry said something that removes any remaining doubt about how he felt. There is a documented account, noted by historians and drawn from contemporary sources, that Henry told Jane Seymour that she owed her position to him, and that he had sent his last wife to the scaffold partly as a warning, a demonstration of what happens to a queen who overstepped. He used Anne's death as a threat against the next woman. That is not a man music carrying guilt. That is not a man who looked back. That is a man who looked at what he had done and decided it was useful. Something to hold over the next person in line. He left no headstone, no marker, no acknowledgement that she was even buried where she was. He left nothing. And so, she lay there, in the church of St. Peter ad Vincula, inside the tower walls, surrounded by other people he had destroyed, unmarked, unnamed music for 340 years until 1876, when Queen Victoria ordered the chapel restored, and the workers began to dig. What they found when they opened that floor is the part of this story that nobody tells you fully. Because the bones were there, but they were not where they should have been. Something had happened in that grave. Something that raised questions nobody has been able to answer completely, even now. What they found inside her grave, they expected to find a queen. What they found was a mystery. By the 1860s, St. Peter ad Vincula was in a serious state, not just architecturally. Centuries of burials had left the floor uneven, sunken in places, and according to the sanitary reports of the time, genuinely hazardous. Bodies had been pushed aside to make room for more bodies. Bones had been moved, displaced. Stack. The historian Lord Macaulay, writing about the chapel, called it the saddest spot on earth. Not because of its appearance, but because of what it contained. 34 notable figures, he noted, had been buried there. Not people celebrated for wisdom or achievement, as in Westminster Abbey, but people brought low by power, by politics, by the decisions of men who outlived them. Queen Victoria read the reports. She was not amused. She ordered a full restoration. The man who documented what happened next was Courtenay Bell, secretary to the Queen's Privy Purse. He was present throughout. He took notes, and he later published a detailed account that remains to this day the primary source for everything we know about what was found beneath those stones. The original plan had been modest: replace the pews, relay the floor. But when the pews were removed, the floor beneath was visibly wrong, sunken, hollow in places. The team had no choice. The paving stones had to come up. On the 9th of November, 1876, they began in the chancel, the section directly in front of the altar. This was where the most significant burials were recorded. Anne Boleyn, her brother George, the Duke of Northumberland, Catherine Howard, Jane Boleyn, and Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, using historical maps and old burial records. Bell and the team identified the spot where Anne should be. They lifted the stones. They began to music dig. 2 feet down, they found bones. But here is what stopped them cold. The bones had not been music left as they were buried. They had been moved, gathered together into a smaller space than a body would naturally occupy, rearranged as if someone had reached into the earth, shifted them, and recovered them. The original arrow chest had long since rotted away, but the bones themselves, the evidence of a woman, had been disturbed recently enough that Bell could say they had not been touched in at least a century, meaning the disturbance happened sometime before the mid-1700s. His best explanation is that a woman named Hannah Beresford had been buried nearby around 1570, and the digging for her grave had disrupted Anne's. It is a reasonable explanation, but then Bell noted something else, something he did not dwell on, but which stays in the mind. The teeth are extraordinarily durable. They survive centuries in the earth, often better than bone, and had been roughly 35 years old at death. A woman of that age in reasonable health should have had most of her teeth. Several were missing. The lower jaw was incomplete. Teeth that should have been there weren't. Bell offered no explanation. He recorded music the absence and moved on. But the implication is clear enough. Someone, at some point, had taken pieces of her relics, souvenirs from a queen's unmarked grave. We do not know who. We do not know when. We may never know. The remains were examined by Dr. Frederick Muat, the government inspector brought in specifically for this purpose. And what he found, even in fragments, was remarkable. The skeleton belonged to a woman he estimated to be between 25 and 30 years of age. Delicate in frame, slender proportions, a small forehead, a notably small jaw. And then the detail that made the room go quiet. The atlas vertebra. The small bone at the very top of the spine, the one that connects the skull to the neck, was exceptionally small, uncommonly so, and had stood on the scaffold and joked about her little neck. The bone bore witness to the truth of it. She had not been performing modesty. Her neck had genuinely been small and slender, and the French swordsman had been called because an axe, a heavier, less precise instrument, might have taken more than one blow on a neck that fine. Henry's mercy, it turns out, was also practical, arithmetic. Muat's examination was methodical. Bell recorded every detail. And when you read that record carefully, something extraordinary happens. The woman begins to reassemble herself from the fragments. The skull showed a round head, a broad, straight forehead. Molt used the word intellectual, though we should note that this was the era of phrenology. The now debunked theory that skull shape could indicate intelligence. We can set that aside. What the skull actually showed in measurable terms was this: large eye sockets, an oval face, a jaw with a modestly square chin. Now, look at the only contemporary likeness we have of Anne Boleyn. A portrait medal struck in 1534 during her lifetime. Oval face, defined chin. The match is striking. Her height, estimated from the long bones of her legs, was placed between 5 feet and 3 in. Contemporary sources describe her as being of middling height for a woman of her time. That fits precisely. Her hands, or what remained of them, told a particular story. The finger bones were slender, tapering, delicate in proportion. And here, something crosses the centuries unexpectedly. Elizabeth was famous throughout her reign for her hands, long fingers, elegant hands. Courtiers wrote about them. Artists painted them, music prominently. Those hands came from her mother. And then, there is another detail in Belle's account. The kind of thing that makes you set the book down for a moment. There is a rumor about Anne Boleyn. A claim that she had a 6th finger. It's one of those details that has stuck in popular imagination for centuries. Not because it was ever proven, but because it was useful. Molt found no evidence of it. However, only 11 of the expected 28 finger bones were recovered. More than half were simply gone, dissolved in the earth, disturbed, taken. We cannot say she didn't have a 6th finger. Greater than music, greater than we also cannot say she did. The bones that would have answered the question were not there. But, when we look at the contemporary record, the people who actually saw her at court, served her daily, and observed her in life, none of them mention anything unusual about her hands. In a court, where even small details were carefully noted, such an obvious feature would not have gone unrecorded. The rumor was started by a Catholic polemicist writing decades after her death. A man with reasons to make her monstrous. It was propaganda then, it remains music propaganda now. Now, the actual question is, were these remains really Anne Boleyn's? But here's where the story gets complicated. DNA confirmation did not exist in 1876. There was no way to say with absolute certainty that these were Anne's remains at all. What Molt and Bell could say with confidence was this: the bones were all from one person. They were consistent in size and proportion. There were no other female remains in the immediate area. The bones were in the location where historical records said and should be, and the physical details matched, point by point. White contemporaries had written about the living woman, but they were working by candlelight in 1876 with the tools of their time. They could measure and compare. What they could not do, what no one in 1876 could do, was prove it beyond all doubt. So, the question that has sat under that floor for nearly 150 years remains unanswered. Was it really her? Nobody knows. Not for certain. Not yet. And while that question sat unanswered, 2 days later, the team moved their shovels to another section of the same floor. What they found there was equally disturbing, because Anne Boleyn was in